I'm joined in the studio this hour by Dan Perry. He's the author of the Ask Questions Later newsletter and the former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press. Good to see you, Dan.
See you, Laura.
Also with me, Shiri Fein-Grossman, a member of Forum Dvora, Women in Foreign Policy and National Security, and she is the former head of regional affairs at the Israel National Security Council. Great to have you with us, Shiri, as well. So, Dan, I'll start with you because I believe you have just written a piece about this. The IDF says that what is happening in the West Bank is that Iran is trying to essentially recreate what it did in Gaza. It's trying to flood the area with weapons. Those weapons, of course, can then be used against Israelis. I
think the IDF has some credibility here. And also, by the way, according to reports, American officials and even some Iranian officials are confirming much the same. You don't need to be a mind reader to understand that the axis of resistance, Iran-backed Hamas and the others, wanted from the beginning for there to be a multi-front war. And they assumed Hezbollah would join in, which they did, immediately after October 7th, after the Hamas invasion. And the next aspiration was for the West Bank to erupt in a third intifada. That hasn't exactly happened, but it's not as if it's been quiet. Israel's been engaged in quite intensive counter-terrorist activity in the West Bank for the past 11 months. Airstrikes and raids throughout. There have been some 600 Palestinians killed. Now this, and about 30 settlers and Israeli soldiers. This simply has been dwarfed by the bigger catastrophe in Gaza. But it's there all the time. The West Bank is a problem that never went away. And there is very real fear that we're approaching a point where the IDF will no longer be able to necessarily, keep the lid on this boiling cauldron, because you have this incredibly toxic brew of an angry population, Iran smuggling in weapons clearly designed to flood the zone with armaments in order to enable terrorism to happen, Jewish extremist settlers rampaging, and a reckless government that's projecting indifference to those rampages that are further harming Israel's diplomatic position in the world and angering the Palestinians yet further. So anyone who wants normalcy to prevail has to hope that all these factors somehow can change very soon.
This is in a strategic move. It's also trying to weaken the Jordan kingdom and to move supplies towards it. And again, how do you fund what's going on in Syria? How does the Assad regime, through captagons and drugs that are going through Jordan, and these routes of drugs and terror, they're all very much intertwined and similar. So we got everything here boiling up, and then really the architect of the whole show is Iran, and this is what we should focus on.
And Dan, what about comments from the Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, who's been talking about evacuating citizens from West Bank towns? That sparked a lot of alarms in Europe, for example.
Yeah. I mean, let's suppose Israel did such a thing, which I wouldn't necessarily support. Would you have to telegraph it now? Would you have to start making statements now? Israel Katz is responsible for the early decision by the ICJ saying Israel might be committing genocide and is acting illegally in the West Bank. A lot of that was justified by tweets by Israel Katz suggesting horrible things about the Palestinians.
President Herzog was also cited in that case.
No, not like this. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what he wrote. So look, he's not, a few would accuse Israel's current foreign minister of a Solomonic level of wisdom. Now, should Israel comport itself in the West Bank the way it has done in Gaza, where basically it's a full-out war? That may not be wise. On the other hand, I have to laugh at the UN Secretary General who rushes to criticize, because whereas Israel's presence in West Bank and the way it goes about its affairs in West Bank, the enmeshing of itself in West Bank is a pretty bad idea in my view, and I've felt that for
you would prefer a unilateral withdrawal?
I would prefer something other than flooding the zone with Jewish settlers, making it effectively part of Israel, which harms Israel's claim to be a democracy, because the Palestinians don't have the right to vote, and creates a binational state, which is not the Jewish ambition for the state of Israel. But the thing is, even though Israel may be ultimately unwise in its overall West Bank policies, the security fears about the West Bank are very real, very real. And if the West Bank is armed to the point that Gaza was, and ends up under the control of radicals the way Gaza was, we have to remember it surrounds Jerusalem on 3 sides and comes within 20 miles of Tel Aviv. Israel will not be able to tolerate in any way that degree of a threat. We would have a real serious war with a bigger population, Palestinian population in the middle than we had in Gaza. So this is completely intolerable. And if Israel doesn't do these actions, you know what? A well-armed expeditionary UN force would have to.
Hostage negotiations are ongoing, aren't they, Shiri? Although we don't seem to be making much progress. They've kind of gone back to the drawing board. As those talks continue, there is increasingly significant pressure on Hamas. The IDF saying today that 80% of the tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor have been destroyed. They're also saying that the Rafah battalion is on its last legs. I mean, what do you read into that?
I read into that, the situation is pretty much standstill. It's not moving in any direction. The IDF has lost 10 soldiers in the past week. So that means that Hamas is learning the IDF movement and is striking back, and that's exactly what it wants to get to sort of this non-stopping like Vietnam War, that we have casualties every week, and that Israel regrets the fact that it's in Gaza.
Do you think, Dan, that the strategy is to keep the pressure on Hamas, and then you don't have to agree to such a tough deal?
There's what we can observe, and then there's the claims. Remember, I don't want to say anyone's speaking untruth, but the military on several occasions said they totally controlled northern Gaza. They controlled central Gaza. And we see that, in fact, it isn't exactly so. And every time they go into an operation and pull out, the area is recaptured in one form or another by Hamas. And so we keep hearing of Hamas resistance in Han Yunis and Deir al-Balach, even in Gaza City. I agree with Shiri. I mean, the strategy as it currently stands appears to be aimed at a multi-year war and an insurgency of the kind that the Americans faced in Iraq. That seems to be what Hamas wants, while they continue to try to inflame the other fronts and bring about their vision of a multi-front attack on Israel. And the other party that benefits from this, and again, I hate to sound cynical, but it's the Israeli government that knows that the minute the war is over, then that is when the political recriminations over the unspeakable debacle of October 7th would occur. And so they're always under suspicion of trying to prolong the war. But there are real legitimate goals that they can pursue, like the Philadelphia corridor. But on the other hand, they have to be put in the overall context of what you're giving up if you prolong the war to pursue those goals.
All right, thank you both. So let's talk about the Philadelphia corridor, because this is the 9-mile stretch along the Gaza-Egypt border. The IDF took control of it back in May, and the fate of this corridor is one of the sticking points in hostage negotiations today. There is an accusation that Prime Minister Netanyahu kind of threw this in at the last minute in the hostage negotiations, insisting that Israel must retain control of the Philadelphia corridor.
And it appears to be true, because the ceasefire proposal that was presented as an Israeli proposal by President Biden on May 31st basically amounted to a 3-stage Israeli withdrawal from the entire Gaza Strip, which includes the Philadelphia corridor, in exchange for XYZ, mainly a return of all the hostages. Now Israel insists on retaining part of the Gaza Strip, which is the Philadelphia corridor. That appears to be a change to its own proposal, which is what is engendering all the claims that Netanyahu wants to prolong the war. Now, it isn't completely absurd for Israel to want to control the Philadelphia corridor, because that does amount to the Egypt-Gaza border. Egypt has failed rather spectacularly in preventing smuggling of weapons into Gaza. It would be good for Israel to control the Philadelphia corridor. It will also be good for lowering of taxes. But Israel just imposed a special tax because of the war. A lot of things would be good. The question is, what is the overall picture? If it's true, as appears to be potentially the case, that Israel can end the war, withdraw from Gaza, leave Hamas beaten, much beaten, but still in command of Gaza, get all the hostages back alive, and then see what happens and avoid a regional war, and maybe even get peace with Saudi Arabia, the global umbrella with NATO and the Sunni states against Iran, that might be a better trade-off than giving up on all these things, having all the hostages die, having more soldiers die, in order to keep the Philadelphia corridor, which can always be returned to, even if one abandons it tomorrow.
We are still waiting to see what Iran will do, and it seems that the Americans think that the Iranians might do something soon.
No one knows. There were a few weeks where the Americans thought the Iranians had been deterred by the fact that massive carrier groups have been brought to the Middle East, and major sabers had been rattled, with the U.S. threatening Iran with cataclysmic circumstances. None of us are mind readers, and the group of people in Iran and also in Hamas, rather Hezbollah, that make these decisions is very small. They're pretty expert at disinformation and distractions, and we'll have to wait and see. I continue to assess that the Iranians don't want to provoke the Americans into a major strike, and it is within, I think, America's competence, the United States' competence, to deter them if they weren't completely risk averse and completely driven by electoral concerns in the U.S. right now, whereby the American voter does not really want to risk another Middle Eastern misadventure. Like Iraq and Afghanistan. But honestly, I mean, the weakness displayed by America vis-a-vis the Houthis, for example, is the kind of thing that in the Middle East only invites further attack. And the Iranian regime is sufficiently brittle that I should think that there is some leverage to be deployed against them.
The United States has really only struck back, I think, 5 times compared to almost 200 attacks by Iranian actors and their terror proxies over the last year and a half. That imbalance right there shows to Iran that they can get away with almost anything without U.S. retaliation.
Gabriel, stay with me. Dan, Dan Perry's with me in the studio. He wanted to ask you a question.
I wonder what you think about a possible third way. The U.S. Hitherto has been either, standing for de-escalation at all costs, as Laura said. That's a democratic perspective, or Trump, who maybe threatens a little bit and talks tough, but basically is an isolationist who's seen as unlikely to do very much either. I wonder, do you think that the Iranians would be shocked into some sort of strategic shift by a policy that basically says, we're going to continue to tolerate your oppressing your people for the next X number of years in exchange for a complete and total revision, where you end your nuclear ambitions and stop fomenting terrorism around the region? You just have to stop that. Otherwise, we will attack your nuclear sites, we'll disable your ports, we'll attack your key infrastructure, and we'll foment revolution. Now, I understand that sounds a bit pugilistic, but could it work? Do you think they would be stunned into a sort of introspection by such a thing?
Well, it sounds actually a little bit like Trump's first-term policy that he said. He's always said that he does not believe in and want regime change inside Iran. He just wants them to curtail their nuclear program, their terror support. So that, unfortunately, didn't work on the Iranian regime first term of President Trump, because at the end of the day, they believe if you're not advancing your nuclear program and you're not advancing on the conventional front, then you've abandoned the revolution and its ideological goals. Again, like most revisionist regimes, if you are not expanding and pushing the envelope, you have failed and you've really admitted defeat here. Well, I think for Iran, that makes that dilemma really problematic.
I would say Trump spoke loudly but carried a very small stick. And I'm suggesting a third way where the stick would be big. I understand your point that would undermine their greater goal of expanding the revolution, but maybe they would prefer to preserve what is.
We can see there is no de-escalation. The Houthis continue to attack global shipping and cause havoc.
It's a terrible mistake. Much as I personally sometimes come across as an extreme moderate with the Palestinian areas, I think with Iran and its proxies, I would be far harsher. I would counsel the Americans to walk away from this de-escalation at all cost notion, because it brings only escalation. The Houthis have been basically, like in a Pavlovian way, have been trained to see that they can impede a third of global maritime traffic, at least container traffic, do incredible harm to Egypt's economy, bring unbelievable wreckage to their own people. In Yemen, 400,000 people have died in the past decade that Sherry mentioned. There's been this civil war, slightly over half by famine and disease, but almost half by warfare. And somehow this is tolerated. It's beyond belief. And this notion that the Houthis are merely Israel and Egypt's problem, or Saudi Arabia's problem, or Hezbollah is just Egypt's problem, is wrong. Because in a worst case scenario, it brings about not just a regional war, but a world war. really, because Syria and China could end up being emboldened by all this. The skullduggeries they can do are truly frightening. And if NATO exists for a reason, it is to lay down the law along the global rules of war. And maintaining the global world order for the stability that benefits everyone quicker than this. A year of Houthi misbehavior is about a year too much.
All right. Dan Perry, Shiri Fine-Grossman, thank you very much indeed to you both.
Thank you.